This was not a family argument. This was an institutional alarm bell ringing inside the palace. For years, the public was told that tensions inside the royal family were emotional, personal, even petty. Hurt feelings, sibling rivalry, a messy fallout played out in interviews and headlines. But what happened behind closed doors this time was something entirely different and far more serious. Because today, the palace did something it almost never does. It confirmed the existence of an internal, accusatory security dossier, one that had been quietly discussed, reviewed, and archived for years. And with that confirmation came a message that landed like a thunderclap. This was never about money, and it was never about forgiveness. It was about risk. According to multiple sources familiar with royal procedures, this dossier was not a rumor, not tabloid speculation, and not an internet conspiracy. It was a formal file, one that raised allegations, flagged concerns, and questioned past associations in ways that made senior figures deeply uncomfortable. And when financial pressure in California collided with that dormant file, the response was immediate and unforgiving. No bailout, no quiet assistance, no compromise. Instead, a deal was blocked, access was cut, and a line was drawn that cannot be erased. What makes this moment so explosive is not what the palace revealed, but what it chose not to deny. Because in royal language, confirmation without detail is often more powerful than denial. Tonight, we are going to walk through how a private dossier became an active threat, why a so-called Covert Pact triggered institutional panic, and how a decision made in the name of stability may have permanently changed the balance of power inside the monarchy. Stay with me because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this wasn't anger, it was containment. At the center of this rupture stands Prince William, and the most important thing to understand about his role in this moment is simple but uncomfortable. William was not acting as a brother, he was acting as an institution. For much of his life, William has been publicly framed as the quieter sibling, the cautious one, the traditionalist, the man content to wait his turn. But that image hides a crucial reality that insiders have long understood. From a remarkably young age, William was prepared not for celebrity, but for continuity, not for popularity, but for responsibility. And responsibility, at this level, comes with a rule that overrides all others. Personal loyalty never outweighs institutional survival. This is where many outside observers misunderstand what happened. They imagine a furious phone call, a shouting match, an emotional rejection, but the reports coming out of palace-adjacent circles describe something colder and far more deliberate. When William reviewed the situation, he did not begin with sentiment. He began with exposure. As future head of state, William is briefed not only on ceremonial matters, but on reputational risk, foreign entanglements, and scenarios that could destabilize the monarchy's position at home and abroad. In that framework, financial distress is not merely a private problem, it becomes a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities attract pressure from media, from political actors, and, most concerning of all, from foreign interests. This is why the existence of the Royal Saudi Dossier mattered so profoundly. Its presence alone altered the equation. Regardless of conclusions, regardless of intent, the file represented something William could not ignore, a documented concern that had already passed through senior review channels. To sign off on financial assistance under those conditions would not have been an act of compassion, it would have been an act of endorsement, and endorsement carries consequences. History offers uncomfortable parallels. Monarchies that survived the 20th century did so not by indulging personal relationships, but by enforcing distance when necessary. Time and again, heirs who failed to draw lines early were forced into humiliating retreats later, often after far greater damage had been done. William knows this history intimately. He was raised on it. That is why his response reportedly felt so absolute. The deal was not paused, it was terminated. Access was not delayed, it was denied. And the message was unmistakable. Whatever sympathy may exist privately, the institution will not be placed in a position where it must explain, defend, or sanitize unresolved questions. This was not cruelty. It was risk management. And in William's world, risk is never neutral. It either shrinks or it spreads. By choosing containment now, William accepted something deeply personal, that history may judge him as cold, even ruthless. But in his calculus, that judgment is preferable to something far worse, a monarchy forced into reactive damage control by choices it could have prevented. If Prince William was the one who drew the line, then the person who helped define where that line had always been is Princess Anne. To the public, Princess Anne is often perceived as a ceremonial figure, dutiful, blunt, and largely uninterested in modern spectacle. But within royal operations, she occupies a very different position. She is not a strategist in the political sense, and she is not a decision-maker in the way a future monarch must be. Instead, she represents something far more enduring: institutional memory. In systems built to last centuries, memory is power. For decades, Princess Anne has been involved in roles that place her at the intersection of protocol, continuity, and quiet oversight. She is known among palace staff and former advisors as someone who reads everything and forgets nothing. That reputation matters here, because the Royal Saudi Dossier did not emerge suddenly in a moment of panic. It existed because concerns had been raised earlier, reviewed carefully, and preserved rather than dismissed. This is where an important clarification must be made, especially for American audiences. Royal vetting is not a criminal investigation. It is not a prosecution. It does not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Vetting is about risk, not guilt. When an individual enters proximity to the monarchy, especially through marriage, a standard process is triggered. That process examines financial patterns, social networks, prior associations, and potential vulnerabilities, not to accuse, but to assess exposure. Most of the time, these reviews conclude quietly, their contents archived and forgotten. But occasionally, a file does not close cleanly. According to multiple accounts from former palace aides and security consultants, the dossier in question was one such file. It raised allegations. It questioned timelines. It highlighted associations that, while not illegal, were considered unusual enough to warrant retention rather than disposal. In institutional language, this is known as an open risk profile, a designation that does not fade with time. This is why Princess Anne's role is so significant. She was reportedly among the first senior royals to insist that the file be treated seriously rather than dismissed as discomfort or prejudice. From her perspective, history had already offered too many examples of what happens when institutions ignore early warning signs because they appear inconvenient. In her view, unresolved questions do not disappear. They accumulate. The dossier was therefore neither buried nor weaponized. It was archived, a deliberate choice that signals caution without escalation. But archiving is not forgetting. It is a way of saying, this may matter later. And years later, it did. When financial pressure intensified and unconventional solutions began circulating, the existence of that archived file changed the entire risk calculation. The moment money, foreign interests, and unresolved concerns intersected, the dossier ceased to be historical background. It became operational context. This is the point many critics miss. The palace did not react emotionally to headlines. It reacted procedurally to convergence. Princess Anne's influence lies precisely here. She did not need to argue. She did not need to persuade. The presence of the file itself spoke louder than any opinion. Once reopened, it forced decision-makers to act within a framework that had already been defined years earlier. For William, that framework was binding. Ignoring the dossier would not have been an act of kindness. It would have been a violation of protocol and a gamble with consequences far beyond one family. In institutions where continuity is everything, precedent is treated as obligation. This explains why the response appeared so cold, so final, and so uncompromising. It was not driven by anger or rivalry. It was driven by a system doing exactly what it was designed to do when uncertainty meets pressure. In the next section, we turn to the human cost of that system and examine how financial strain in the United States transformed a dormant concern into an immediate crisis, placing Prince Harry in a position he never anticipated and may not fully understand even now. To understand how this situation escalated so quickly, we have to shift the lens away from London and look squarely at the American side of the equation, because this is where the pressure became real. For Prince Harry, the move to the United States was framed as a declaration of independence, financial freedom, personal autonomy, a life outside institutional constraints, and for a time, that narrative appeared to hold. High-profile contracts, media attention, access to elite social circles, the image of a couple building something new on their own terms. But independence comes with a cost, and in America, that cost is measured relentlessly. Unlike the royal system, where housing, security, and infrastructure are absorbed by the institution, life in the United States pushes those burdens directly onto the individual. Property taxes arrive every year without exception. Insurance premiums fluctuate with environmental risk. Private security is not symbolic, it is a monthly line item. And when income becomes irregular, those fixed costs do not adjust out of sympathy. This is where the misunderstanding began. From a royal perspective, financial strain is a warning sign. From an American perspective, it is a challenge to be managed. Many viewers watching this from the United States will recognize that instinct immediately. When pressure mounts, you refinance. You renegotiate. You explore partnerships. You look for liquidity. That is not recklessness, it is standard practice. But here is the critical difference. When you are a private citizen, unconventional financial solutions affect only you. When you are a royal figure, they affect the institution attached to your name. This is where the palace's alarm intensified. What might appear in California as a pragmatic response to financial strain looks, from London, like exposure, not because of intent, but because of optics, leverage, and precedent. In American culture, relationships often precede structure. Deals are personal before they are formal. In British institutional culture, the sequence is reversed. Structure comes first. Relationships are secondary. Anything that bypasses established channels, no matter how well-intentioned, raises concern. Harry did not grow up operating in the American system, but he entered it fully and quickly. The pace alone created vulnerability. Contracts tied to performance. Public expectations tied to output. A lifestyle scaled for continuity rather than fluctuation. When those elements drift out of alignment, pressure accumulates quietly, then all at once. This is the moment when the palace stopped viewing the situation as distant. Financial strain, by itself, does not trigger intervention. Financial strain, combined with unresolved questions, does. From the institutional viewpoint, this was not about controlling a life choice. It was about preventing a scenario where financial urgency could force decisions that the monarchy would later have to explain or defend. Here, it is important to pause and acknowledge something often overlooked in public debate. Harry may not have believed he was taking risks. He may have believed he was adapting. But systems judge outcomes, not intentions. For viewers watching from outside the United Kingdom, especially those in the United States, this tension may feel familiar. Many of you have faced moments where independence brought unexpected exposure, where freedom required trade-offs that were not obvious at the start. If you're watching tonight, I'd be interested to know where you're joining us from. Please feel free to share your city and country in the comments below. It helps us understand how widely this conversation resonates. The tragedy here is not financial miscalculation. It is cultural misalignment. Harry stepped fully into an American model of self-determination, while still carrying the symbolic weight of a British institution that does not operate on improvisation. And when those two worlds collided, there was no neutral ground. From the palace's perspective, the question was no longer whether Harry could sustain his lifestyle. The question was whether the institution could afford to absorb the consequences of choices made under pressure, outside its oversight. That is why the response felt sudden. That is why doors closed instead of opening. And that is why what might look, from one angle, like abandonment looks, from another, like preemptive containment. The phrase that caused the most alarm inside palace circles was not debt, not California, and not even foreign money. It was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. A covert pact. To be clear from the outset, this term does not automatically imply conspiracy, illegality, or espionage. In institutional language, a covert pact refers to any financial or relational arrangement that exists outside established oversight frameworks, particularly when public figures are involved. It is not defined by secrecy alone. It is defined by opacity. In private life, opacity can be benign. In institutional life, it becomes a liability. What concerned palace advisors was not the existence of relationships or financial discussions; those are inevitable in modern public life. What raised alarms was the possibility that such arrangements were being explored without alignment, visibility, or institutional clearance at a moment of heightened financial pressure. This is where perception overtook intent. From the palace's vantage point, the danger was not that a deal might be improper, but that it might be interpreted as improper by the press, by political actors, or by foreign observers with their own agendas. Once that perception takes hold, it cannot be selectively managed. It spreads, and perception, in matters of state, has weight. In diplomatic history, reputations are rarely damaged by proven wrongdoing alone. They are damaged by unanswered questions, by gaps in explanation, by narratives that others are free to fill. That is why the word covert carries such force. It does not accuse. It suggests uncertainty, and uncertainty is what institutions are designed to eliminate. This distinction matters deeply for understanding the palace's response. Had every conversation, every inquiry, every potential financial pathway been routed through formal channels, concerns might have been absorbed and neutralized. But once the possibility emerged that discussions were occurring beyond that structure, the institution faced a choice: tolerate ambiguity or shut it down decisively. Historically, institutions choose certainty. For a monarchy, the stakes are amplified. The crown does not operate as a private brand. It functions as a symbol of continuity, one that must remain insulated from even the appearance of leverage. This is not about mistrust of individuals. It is about distrust of scenarios that cannot be fully controlled. In this context, the Covert Pact was not evaluated on its merits. It was evaluated on its risk profile. Could it create future obligations? Could it invite speculation about influence? Could it complicate diplomatic relationships already sensitive in tone and history? If the answer to any of those questions was possibly, the calculus was already complete. This is the institutional mindset that often confounds outside observers, especially in the United States. American culture is comfortable with ambiguity. Deals evolve. Relationships precede regulation. Transparency is sometimes retroactive. But institutions rooted in centuries of continuity operate differently. They prioritize preemption over correction. Once again, intent was secondary. What mattered was exposure. And exposure has a way of multiplying when money, public status, and unresolved narratives intersect. A private financial decision can become a public controversy overnight. A rumor can become a headline. A headline can become a diplomatic footnote. And footnotes in international affairs are never forgotten. This is why the palace did not attempt to clarify or negotiate the arrangement. It did not request revisions. It did not seek reassurances. It simply blocked the pathway altogether. From the outside, this can look harsh, even disproportionate. But from inside the system, it appears logical. Institutions are not designed to give second chances to uncertainty. They are designed to prevent first mistakes. The irony, of course, is that what might have been manageable at an earlier stage became intolerable precisely because it surfaced under pressure. Financial urgency compresses timelines. It forces speed, and speed is the enemy of institutional comfort. By the time concerns reached senior levels, the situation had already crossed a threshold. The combination of financial stress, unresolved background questions, and informal exploration of alternatives created a profile that could not be endorsed even passively. Thus, the pact was labeled. And once labeled, it was finished. From the outside, the palace's response appeared sudden, even extreme. Observers expected delay, negotiation, perhaps a quiet compromise reached behind closed doors. That is how crises are often managed in corporate or political environments. But what happened here followed a very different logic. The deal was not paused. It was not revised. It was terminated. To understand why, we need to examine how institutions respond when multiple risk vectors converge at once. Inside the palace, the issue was never framed as a single decision. It was viewed as an accumulation problem: financial pressure, reputational sensitivity, foreign perception, unresolved background questions. None of these elements alone would have triggered a decisive intervention. Together, they formed a pattern that institutions are trained to recognize and to neutralize early. This is where many misunderstand the nature of power at this level. Institutions do not wait for proof of failure. They act when probabilities begin to align. Once that threshold is crossed, hesitation becomes the greater risk. The palace's advisors reportedly understood that allowing even temporary continuation of the arrangement would create an implicit endorsement, and endorsement, once granted, is difficult to revoke without consequences. If the deal later unraveled publicly, the institution would be forced into a reactive posture, explaining why it had allowed something it now claimed to oppose. That scenario was unacceptable. So the decision was framed not around fairness, but around containment. Containment is a concept borrowed from national security, not family counseling. It prioritizes limiting future exposure over addressing present discomfort, and it often requires actions that feel disproportionate in the moment to prevent far greater damage later. This explains why the palace did not seek assurances or additional documentation. Those steps would have acknowledged legitimacy where uncertainty still existed. Instead, it chose a cleaner outcome: sever the pathway entirely. The result was not merely rejection, but isolation. Access to institutional support was withdrawn. Informal channels closed. The message delivered implicitly, if not explicitly, was that any arrangement operating outside the established framework would not be tolerated under current conditions. This is not a judgment on motives, it is a judgment on manageability. For the monarchy, manageability is paramount. It determines whether narratives can be guided or whether they spiral beyond control. Once a story becomes unmanageable, it ceases to belong to the institution. It becomes property of the media, political actors, and public speculation. That is what the palace was determined to avoid. There is also a historical dimension that cannot be ignored. Monarchies that failed in the modern era often did so not because of moral collapse, but because of delayed intervention. They waited too long to draw boundaries, hoping that personal relationships or public goodwill would resolve structural problems. It rarely worked. Those lessons are institutional memory now. This is why the decision felt final, because reversibility was no longer an option. Any appearance of wavering would invite scrutiny. Any attempt at compromise would reopen questions that had just been sealed. By dismantling the deal decisively, the palace achieved three objectives simultaneously. First, it removed ambiguity. Second, it signaled internal discipline. Third, it reset expectations not just for those directly involved, but for anyone watching closely. This last point matters more than most realize. Institutions communicate not only through statements, but through actions. A firm response establishes precedent. It tells future actors where the boundaries lie without needing to restate them. Of course, this approach comes at a cost. It strains relationships, it hardens perceptions, and it leaves little room for reconciliation in the short term. But from the institutional perspective, short-term discomfort is preferable to long-term vulnerability. The palace did not see itself as choosing sides. It saw itself as choosing stability. And stability, once threatened, demands clarity, not compassion. This brings us to the most difficult dimension of this entire episode: the human consequence of institutional logic. Because while systems may operate dispassionately, individuals do not. In the final section, we examine the ultimatum that followed and the impossible choice it created, one that forces a reckoning not just with power, but with identity itself. When the noise fades and the speculation settles, what remains is not a scandal, but a lesson, one that reaches far beyond palaces and titles. This story reminds us that institutions do not move on emotion. They move on patterns, probabilities, and consequences. Where individuals hope for understanding, systems demand predictability. And when those two forces collide, the outcome is rarely gentle. There is something profoundly human here. Independence is seductive. Many of us, at some point, have believed that stepping away from structure would bring freedom. Sometimes it does. But just as often, freedom without guardrails introduces new vulnerabilities, financial, reputational, and personal, that only become visible when pressure arrives. From my personal perspective, this is not a story about villains or heroes. It is a story about misaligned expectations. One side believed loyalty would soften rules. The other believed rules must outlast loyalty. Neither position is irrational, but only one can govern an institution meant to endure. And that is the uncomfortable truth. Systems are built to survive people, not to accommodate them. For viewers watching from everyday lives, managing mortgages, careers, reputations, and families, this lesson may feel familiar. Stability often demands choices that are misunderstood in the moment, even by those closest to us. Boundaries, once crossed, are far harder to redraw than they are to enforce early. At Edge of Legacy, we don't just follow headlines, we examine the structures beneath them and the human cost of decisions made in the name of continuity. If this analysis helped you see the story from a new angle, I invite you to like this video, share your perspective in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. And if you value thoughtful breakdowns that go deeper than surface drama, subscribe to Edge of Legacy and join us as we continue exploring the power, pressure, and consequences that shape history, often long before the public ever sees them. Thank you for watching.